Welcome to Philosophy of Value Workshops number 20 of Series 7. The question for today is, to what extent can beliefs be self-indulgent and evade authentic values? The reading for today from one of my works, The Pursuit of Value, Chapter 2, Section 10. So my overall objective is to grasp human existence as consciousness and resolve its problems in terms of value. And we have previously discussed various criteria for determining those values. These have included the coherence, consistency, quality, and the character of the objects of value. These objects of value, like truth and the moral good, constitute a relation between cognition and value states. Today, I want to explain a preference for a certain kind of relation between cognition and value states. 2 weeks ago, we discussed a mode of immediate cognition, like perception, in relation to value. Last week, we discussed the scope of this relation in activities like ethics and meaning or purpose. And we examined modes of cognition such as mysteriousness and attenuated cognition. And this implied a preference for a certain sufficiency or independence of value. As previously argued, that independence, adequacy, or sufficiency of value results from pursuing a principle of affirmation or a will to value or the value of value. Examples of sufficiency of value have been moral fortitude, patience, and courage. Last week, preferences were implied. There were also tacit arguments for such a sufficiency. Some of those explanations and illustrations were as follows. Moral fortitude is the intuitively moral capacity to do the right thing in the absence of social approbation. For example, it's normal for a 5-year-old to constantly seek parental approval, but pathological for a 25-year-old. A similar comparison was also made to religion in seeking approval from divine authority. We also saw that existential choice eschews cognition and reason for action as inviting inauthenticity. Another example was found in Ryan Brown's distinction between dignity cultures and honor cultures. The point is that these examples indicate a preference for independence from cognitive support. And this analysis presupposes that the above social approbation, parental approval, and divine authority are different expressions of cognitive frameworks that support emotional states and value states. I previously explained the nature of that relation between value and cognition in a number of ways. These included Bataille's metaphor of water in a bottle as mental states within a cognitive framework. That relation was also illustrated by the phenomenological view with structures like intentionality. And as shown in examples of value sufficiency, this is a common preference of moral intuition and folk ethics. But this intuition and common form is neither explicit nor a reasoned argument. This week, I want to present explicit arguments for that intuitively compelling independence of value. But in order to avoid repeating the arguments above, I will argue for value sufficiency by discussing different states in which it is absent. Absence is also an inherent feature of value that I have discussed in other workshops. Yet before making those arguments, or want to comment on the negative effects of certain presuppositions. Last week we spoke about people having presuppositions which hindered communication. Simon Blackburn and others have noted people talking past each other in this way with respect to consciousness. Yet this is a common problem in all situations, yet more so in the context of philosophy. In these workshops and other settings, I meet a lot of people with great enthusiasm for particular theories. Such theories can usefully articulate something that couldn't otherwise be expressed. But few people consider the experience that has been produced by the particular theories presented. So we are now talking about awareness of particular experiences produced by particular theories. Last week we discussed the scope of cognitive frameworks of which such theories are a part, and we outlined how they supported underlying experiences. So in these workshops I have been putting the horse before the cart, which is the right order. That is, in these presentations I have been giving priority to value states over cognitive frameworks. The horse represents value states and the cart represents cognitive states. That is correct because, in my view, values, or the horse, pull or drive the cognitive cart in more ways than one. One of these is that people are usually more interested in the cognitive cart than the idea of the horse or value. So today I'm continuing to discuss the relation of value states to cognitive frameworks. Yet also, before presenting any argument, we need to reiterate what is meant by sufficiency of value at issue. We can begin by defining value sufficiency in relation to both intrinsic value and positive value states. Examples of positive and sufficient value states are self-esteem, maturity and magnanimity. We can also say that all sufficient states are intrinsic values, but not all intrinsic values are sufficient values. This is because many intrinsic values are trivial and aren't sufficient as ends like meaning and purpose. And sufficient values are determined by their quality, not quantity, as sufficiency might imply. That is, they must accommodate absence as well as alterity and altruism. And we can further contrast value sufficiency with other uses of the word sufficiency. It isn't the sufficiency in the principle of sufficient reason as the possibility of explanations for everything. Neither is it the sufficiency of necessary and sufficient conditions, nor is it the sufficiency of the immutable physicality in Sartre's being in itself. Yet in some ways we can compare value sufficiency with the sufficiencies of happiness and pleasure. The sufficiency of pleasure is that it remains pleasurable regardless of beliefs or social disapproval. Happiness is more subject to cognition, but happiness is satisfying in itself without endorsement. So the particular sufficiency of value is comparable to that of happiness and pleasure. They are comparable due to relative independence from cognitive endorsement and support. And these three states of pleasure, happiness and value have different origins and different characteristics. Pleasure typically has physiological origins and is less influenced by cognitive factors. Happiness is more subject to circumstances and cognitive considerations. We have previously and above considered positive examples of value sufficiency. But today I want to look at examples of a lack of sufficiency that also provide arguments. To start with, I previously presented the idea of God as an example of a sufficiency of value. Yet religion also affords us examples of insufficient value in a need for conformity and to make conversions. And more general examples of insufficient value can be found in a lack of emotional or psychological resilience. Such insufficiencies seem to be more prevalent in certain sections of society. For example, in situations of heightened sensitivity to offensive or supposedly unsafe speech, or in censorship in educational institutions in order to make way for safe spaces, or when blunt language is seen as microaggression or even as violence. These examples show how value states are greatly subject to cognitive support more than the above affect states, and they show that we need to struggle to attain a measure of maturity and of value sufficiency. And value sufficiency is a relative property that must strive for development through a dialectic. That is, the dialectic between a will to value and the degree of cognitive support needed to sustain it. This dialectic introduces arguments for value sufficiency in terms of its absence in two ways. One of these ways is in its absence in such forms as moral weakness, resentment, and self-indulgence. Another is in the theoretical absence of value from cognitive states such as perception and belief and fact. Other arguments for value sufficiency have been presented and will be presented again in the future. These were about the consistency, coherence, satisfactoriness, and self-validation of value, and that not to value value or to affirm value is contradictory, self-defeating, and self-negating. These arguments will have to be presupposed for the time being. Our immediate concerns are about these relations of value and value sufficiency with cognitive frameworks. We'll first discuss these relations in terms of reason, consistency, and absences and inadequacies of cognition. I will then discuss absences of value sufficiency in such forms as self-indulgent and moral weakness. One argument about consistency also involves relations between value sufficiency and cognitive absences. That is, firstly, the claim of value sufficiency must show that it is genuinely sufficient. This requirement might be thought to be trivial, but not when sufficiency is so easily overlooked. And of course, we have seen that due to human finitude, value sufficiency will be insufficient or imperfect. That is, value sufficiency must also incorporate absence, need, and altruistic concern for others. Yet there is a sense in which value sufficiency must still in principle be sufficient. This seeming paradox can be explained by comparison with a priori judgments. That is, a priori judgments are determined without reference to matters external to that judgment. For example, 1 + 1 = 2 is an a priori judgment that can be assessed on its own mathematical merits. That is, it will be a mistake to refer to psychology or intelligence to assess this judgment. This is the case even though psychology, intelligence, and mathematical training is needed to make this judgment, and the judgment of 1 + 1 = 2 stands independently of these conditions needed to make it. The example of the a priori illustrates how a principle of value must be independent of its preconditions. That is, if value sufficiency is proposed as an answer, then consistency requires it to be an answer in itself. This is the case of an a priori, and Heidegger has made a similar case for the will to will. And other factors should not then be added in order to supplement their validity. Yet, as noted above, we are talking here about the adequacy of the principle of sufficient value. But in real life, there are practical considerations about the preconditions required to support that value state. In this case, one of the preconditions is the support of cognitive frameworks. And cognition is such a precondition that nevertheless must not in principle enter into value sufficiency. One version of this idea can be expressed in Hume's is-ought distinction that I will outline again shortly. That is, cognition, as some other states, must be absent from value sufficiency as a sufficient principle. I have also previously listed such alternatives to value states such as affect states, volition, and crucially cognition. Two affect states often held as paradigms of human satisfaction are pleasure and happiness. And as shown earlier, pleasure and happiness offer forms of sufficiency. But they don't provide the kinds of sufficiency required by human needs like meaning and purpose. And we can note in passing that affect states like happiness are limited by human psychology and physiology, whereas value states are limited by an ability to conceive of values and the will to confirm them. Yet the will or volition is often cited as a human objective, but is similarly inadequate. The will is, however, construed as an objective in Teutonic thinking in Schopenhauer and in Nietzsche. And the will is also a constituent of value. But it is a process or a means to an end rather than an end in itself. The will, thereby, isn't a legitimate objective that can be pursued as an end state or goal. It is a relation or a process towards an end and is idiosyncratic as a human objective. Value sufficiency can now be contrasted to cognition in the context of cognitive non-cognitive distinction. Cognition, of course, consists in states like reason, perception, belief, and knowledge. Yet cognition can be defined more exactly as intentionality towards its cognitive objects. And it's these cognitive objects that largely constitute the character of cognition. But non-cognitive states are constituted by particular experiences, not by any intentional object. And these experiential non-cognitive states are those of affect, volition, and value. Yet we have just excluded affect and volition as alternatives, so we are left with cognition. The potential sufficiency of value can now be contrasted to the experiential emptiness or vacuity of cognition. In practice, however, there is always some entanglement and overlap between cognition and value. And values must invariably entail cognitive objects of what they are valuing. But again, in principle, cognition excludes value. The experiential emptiness of cognition can be readily observed in the processes of logical reason. Mathematics, for example, is widely thought to be an aspect of logic. And like logical reason, mathematics is devoid of physicality or affect. Logical reason and mathematics are abstract through and through without any other content. As promised, Hume's is-ought distinction can also illustrate the independence of value from cognition. A presupposition here is that value has the potential to become the more substantial value sufficiency. Hume's principle is that a prescriptive moral ought cannot be derived from a factual is or morals from reason. And this principle has never been unseated despite many challenges and thought proven by G.E. Moore. Yet Ronald Dworkin presents a positive aspect of Hume's principle that is not just as skepticism about morals. And this positive interpretation sets another boundary around the independence of value. That is, fundamental questions of ethics and value must be answered within value, not outside it. Dworkin speaks of the independence of morality as a separate department of knowledge. And Dworkin's independence implies a priority of value and a capacity to override other factors. This is again comparable to my own preferred interpretation of value as sufficiency and independence. But I'm concerned about Dworkin's view of morality and as a separate and independent department of knowledge. Dworkin is clearly concerned with the ontology of value, as I am, and not just with epistemology. But his description of morality as a department of knowledge raises issues of bias. That is, issues of bias towards the cognition and rationality that Dworkin avidly employs. But this reiterates the issue of relations between cognition and value that is central in this paper. Dworkin's cognitivism and his endorsement of Hume's principle typify an ambivalence in the relations between the independence or sufficiency of value, cognition, and other forms of alterity. Bernard Williams uses the notion of self-indulgence, which alludes to this ambivalence and illuminates other issues. For one, the notion of self-indulgence both articulates and implies an absence of the desired value states. Ambivalence is evident in Williams' criticism of self-sufficiency as an unappetizing ideal and ethically insular. Yet what I have proposed is value sufficiency, not the self-sufficiency of social isolation. And this is a value sufficiency, I argue, that includes rather than excludes other people. Yet in this, Williams' critique of utilitarianism makes several points relevant to our discussion. Firstly, he replies to accusations of self-indulgence by utilitarians of people not getting their hands dirty. Williams, however, rejects this criticism by utilitarians. These are accusations of over-concern with the idea of one's own integrity or purity of virtue at the expense of others. This introduces a concept of self-indulgence as a possible criterion of moral or value judgments. That is, the self-indulgence of basking in a certain idea of oneself. Secondly, Williams also makes the point that not all kinds of reflexive moral thought are self-indulgent. He argues that modelling oneself on some ideally virtuous person isn't an exercise in self-indulgence. This makes the point about the kind of supportive conceptions or frameworks that can be justified. We previously saw how authenticity could be used as a means of assessing relations with principles and objects. And the idea of self-indulgence is another concept in our repertoire of assessing such relations. Value sufficiency can also be defined in terms of its absence in numerous other attitudes. Aristotle similarly defined virtue as a golden mean between excess and deficiency or absence. For example, he took courage as the golden mean between excess as rashness and deficiency as cowardice. Again, for Aristotle, magnanimity is a virtue, whereas vanity is its excess and faint-heartedness is deficiency. And he regarded modesty as a virtue, but in excess as shyness, and shamelessness in deficit. Of course, Aristotle didn't give us a common feature in which all these differences can be measured. Yet I suggest that that feature is value, and value sufficiency or its deficit. And I previously interpreted value virtue theory as value theory, where values replace the virtues. In my own repertoire of values, I've given patience as an example of value sufficiency. Impatience is a lack of sufficient value of the moment, which seeks satisfactions in the future. Another example was moral fortitude, as the capacity to do the right thing independently of social endorsement. Obsequiousness is a dearth of such a capacity in being too eager to please, serve, or obey others. Several other attitudes, usually considered as virtues, can also be similarly criticized as lacking in value. In this way, honor is a less authentic form of self-esteem, whereas dignity is a form of self-esteem. And as above, hope can be regarded as a failure of the present in having to look to the future. Pride is also a defective value and a deficient means of attaining self-value. This is because pride finds value through external attributes rather than valuing oneself. This observation also highlights the importance of knowing what constitutes oneself. As a final illustration of value sufficiency in its absence, I can refer to Tai Nguyen's notion of value collapse. I produced a podcast on Nguyen's value collapse a couple of months ago to show the scope of value. Nguyen gave several examples of value collapse, such as value plurality, explicit values, and value capture. He described value capture as presenting rich and subtle values in an oversimplified manner, and that these simplified values are very attractive, tempting, or what he calls sticky. That is, such simplified but powerful values come to dominate our thinking. He gives the example of pursuing an education and then getting obsessed with marks. But although Nguyen expressed value preferences, he isn't talking about fundamentally right or wrong values. He's concerned about the practical and pragmatic effects, as might be expected in the US. My point is that this deleterious value capture is more likely in the absence of value sufficiency. For example, authentic self-love, or the love of one's partner, or even the love of God, which afford a certain sufficiency of value that can make sticky values like money less attractive. My conclusion is that value sufficiency can be defined in terms of its absence as well as its overt characteristics. Many examples have been given. These were such as moral fortitude, magnanimity, patience and self-esteem. Yet in the foregoing discussion we saw many instances of separation between value sufficiency and other states. These were principally those of affect, volition and crucially cognition. The affect states of pleasure and happiness as well as cognitive states illustrated various forms of sufficiency, but these kinds of sufficiency were ultimately different to the sufficiency of value at issue here. Just as interestingly and more specifically, other value states were shown to involve absences of value, and these absences or deficits of value were also able to illustrate value sufficiency. These were states like honour, hope and pride, as well as impatience and obsequiousness. As arguments, these accounts were descriptive rather than analytic, yet this accords with the phenomenological methods applied here, as well as with the mode of cognition employed in relations with values and value states. Phenomenology has long been defined as an empiricism of the mind, that is, a descriptive account. In science, we similarly obtain descriptive accounts of the world and construct principles of explanation for as long as they remain effective. In a phenomenology of mind and value, we can only hope to do somewhat the same. So let me have your comments and criticisms at the meeting or on websites like Zoom or meetup.com, and I expect to be either told where I've gone wrong or thanked for my explanations. Thank you.